Okay, welcome everybody. So let me just start by introducing myself. My name is Elsa Mann. I'm a resident here in Wellington North, and I want people to know that that's first and foremost why I'm here. I also work in healthcare. I work in rural Wellington as part of a team in healthcare, helping vulnerable individuals get connected to services. And I'm also somebody who's on my own grief journey. So that's another reason why I'm here. So much so that I trained and volunteer with bereaved families of Ontario through their Living with Loss peer-supported group. And I'm also your moderator for today. So timing is something that's important for me. I know it's an evening during the week. It's very important that we wrap up on time, so I'm going to make sure that we get out the door at 9 o'clock and have a very short break partway through the evening. So I've tasked the panelists with introducing themselves, so I could get out of that. But before I do that, I've really felt strongly that we need to acknowledge a few things. There's some big things happening in the world right now. So as Reverend Cheryl noted, we've just been impacted so far, 2 years worth of global pandemic. We've endured so much over that time, and for some, they've experienced a significant amount of loss. But it's also important to look around the room and see that we're actually gathered today. So I feel there's something to be acknowledged about that. I also would like to acknowledge that there's a serious crisis in the world right now with the invading of Ukraine and the war that is impacting so many lives there. And it's not just the war in terms of what's happening today, it's the reliving of wars that our seniors are experiencing, and it's those that have immigrated to Canada who are reliving things that they have left. So I would like us to keep peace in our hearts as we think about all those people. And then as we come together tonight, let's also reflect that it's March 8th, and it's International Women's Day. And I'm so blessed to have some of the women that have inspired me most in this room. So I just wanted to have everybody else reflect on the women in their world. So as we move into tonight's discussion, I wanted to acknowledge the willingness of our panelists to come and share with you tonight in a real and a vulnerable way. The fact that we're sold out for tonight's evening, and then some, because some of you checked on at the last minute, is telling. Our community is really seeking this out, a safe place to come together and have a conversation. The questions we gathered are from all of you. So I didn't write any of these questions. These are from you. And so in that vein, what we did is we kind of synthesized, some of those questions were very similar. We synthesized those together and we created a list of questions that our panelists got in advance. So really the discussion, the conversation tonight is among our panelists. And so I just ask that you listen with openness and respect. If you feel there's questions that we don't get to tonight, and it's really burning for you to be answered, I'm gonna ask that you add it to that feedback form that I left on everybody's chair. So it's also a place for you to give feedback, a note to somebody on the panel if you want to, or feedback on how we ran things tonight. We really welcome all of that. So if you have a question that doesn't get answered tonight, leave it on there and I will find the most appropriate person to answer that to get back to you. Okay? So, and then you can leave those with the greeting table on your way out. So, our conversation tonight can be heavy. May not be comfortable for some people, or comfortable now but not later. We welcome you to take a break, step outside, head over into the gymnasium, just walk around a little bit, and both RoseAnne and Cheryl are more than happy to come out and just touch base with you if you do that, okay? So, without any further ado, I'm going to start at the far end, and I'm going to ask Dr. Chris Lund to introduce himself and explain how he came to be on this panel and what he'd like to contribute today.
I'm Chris Lund. I know a fair number of you in the room already. Maybe I know everybody, and I just can't tell with your masks. Because because I'm easily confused. But anyway, I'm a family doctor by training. These days, I am what's called a GP oncologist. So I am a GP, but I spend about 3/4 of my work hours with people who have cancer. I do a lot of rural palliative care. I do chemotherapy at Groves Hospital. So that's 1 day a week. I've been a MAID practitioner since 2018, not since it's been legal. It took me a little while to kind of understand the law and become accustomed to it. It's complex and it's intricate, and it's also simple in other ways. I think my role here is around process and legalities and those kind of intricacies. I think what I'd like to highlight is that I was doing a little research on this the other day, and there's really only a handful of countries around the world where this is legal. And we come to expect it because we live in a reasonably progressive country and society, but
We heard that, Marianne.
No, that wasn't me. Could you ask Dr. Lund to speak up a bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Sure.
I was saying that we live in a progressive country that allows things like medical assistance in dying. You know that there's only 10 states out of 50 where it's legal, right? So 40 states in the US, it's illegal, and a handful of countries. So I am blessed, and I feel fortunate to live here. Also in the fact that I'm an immigrant. I'm not Canadian originally, I'm from the States, but you can't probably tell that. So I think I'll pass it on here.
Okay. Okay, Rachel's going to speak. She's a little closer to you, Marianne, so you'll hopefully be able to hear her a bit better.
I'm Rachel Weed. My family actually used MAID with my grandfather. He took that advantage. So I'm here with my perspective of being a family member and dealing with it and how it felt and my thoughts on that.
Thanks for being here, Rachel. And I'm going to do Andrea next, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
I wrote a little introduction up here. So my name is Andrea Bird. I'm a local community member and have lived here for about 30 years. For the past 5 years, I've been living with a terminal diagnosis. And I've called this my living with dying time, because these years have asked me to live as fully as I can while navigating the emotional terrain of facing death. And the changes one undergoes in this time are intense and often indescribable, although I do try to share as best I can. At first only to my nearest and dearest, but as time goes by, that circle is expanding, as evidenced tonight. I always noticed, or often noticed, that when the D word came up in conversations, there would be a discernible ripple through the room, like you could feel it land. And it was often an uncomfortable feeling. And I get that, we're not used to talking about death and dying openly. It can be hard and awkward. But I would suggest these conversations are necessary and important. Death comes to us and those we love. And the more comfortable we get with this, the more open we will be when, not if, our time comes. I've found this paradox over the last few years. When we open to death, we open to life as well. So here we are, emerging from 2 years of a global pandemic, perhaps more open to the topic now than ever, or not. But in any case, we are stretched in some way by this collective experience, and I bow to you for being here tonight to step into this conversation, into uncharted territory. Thank you for your presence and courage. I first became aware of MAID when it was legalized in Canada 6 years ago, a year before my terminal diagnosis. When I heard about it, like Dr. Lund said, I was gratified and relieved that I lived in a country where this existed, where it was possible. It was very hypothetical, though. It was for others. It wasn't for me. And then when I became one of those people at end of life, that changed. Suddenly it was real and not hypothetical at all. Over a year ago, I filled out the paperwork for MAID and had 2 doctors assess my eligibility, one of them being Dr. Lund, because the cancer had spread to my brain and it seemed wise to be proactive, to apply as soon as possible in case time ran out on me. One, at that point, and this may still be true, one has to be mentally competent to access MAID. So for me, it is a comfort to know that MAID is in place if need be. My thoughts on it have always been, I'm grateful it is available. I hope that I do not need to use it. And that I can only describe as because I would like to experience death as fully as possible. But if for whatever reason, unbearable emotional or mental anguish, pain that cannot be controlled, or some unforeseen issue that I can't even imagine, then if I choose, I would have a way to end that suffering by accessing MAID. So I'm really glad to be here tonight, and thank you.
Marianne, you're next. I'm wondering if you could just tell people a little bit about what you're bringing to the panel tonight.
Okay. My name is Marianne Cutie. I'm the chair of the GTA chapter, the Greater Toronto Area chapter of Dying with Dignity Canada. I'm a very strong supporter of end-of-life choice, and both my personal and professional life in healthcare, I've seen good deaths and the many bad ones. And I'm a firm believer that people should have choice in end of life. Tonight, I'm here as a rep of Dying with Dignity Canada, and a large part of our mission is to educate. And I saw this as a perfect opportunity. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the organization. Dying with Dignity Canada is a national human rights charity committed to improving quality of dying, protecting end-of-life rights, and helping Canadians avoid unwanted suffering. Our mission is through advocacy and public education and personal support, we ensure Canadians have access to quality end-of-life choice and care. We have a vision that all Canadians have the right to choose their good death. We value collaboration, part of why we're here tonight, compassion, courage, inclusion, integrity, and being people-centered. We focus on 4 key issues, and that's eligibility, access, support, and education around MAID. We ensure eligibility for assisted dying in the legislation, ensuring that it complies with the Canadian Constitution and Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In defending these human rights, we advocate for assisted dying rules by supporting and intervening in court challenges related to Bill C-14. That's the federal legislation that allows for medical assistance in dying. We also work to ensure Canadians can access MAID in compliance with the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Freedoms and Rights through our advocacy work. We provide personal support to adults suffering greatly from a grievous and irremediable medical condition who wish to die on their own terms. We support their families and caregivers, as well as healthcare providers as they explore end-of-life options, including MAID. This includes helping people to understand end-of-life choice, navigate medical assistance in dying requests, providing independent witnesses to their applications, and providing resources regarding advanced care planning, bereavement, and mental health. We also support the healthcare practitioners who assess and provide MAID. We educate Canadians about all of their legal end-of-life options, including the constitutional right to medical assistance in dying, and the importance of advanced care planning. Dying with Dignity Canada was founded in 1982, so surprisingly we're 40 years old. It was started in Ontario and it's grown to a national organization with over 2,500 members. We are a registered charity and fully publicly funded.
How long has MAID been available for in Canada, and has it changed over that time?
We have to go back to the beginning. And this was in February of 2015 when there was a Supreme Court decision that stated the prohibition on physician-assisted dying infringed on the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. So with that decision, it precipitated the passing of Bill C-14, and that didn't come into effect until 2016. So it took them almost a year from the time of the Supreme Court decision to actually get the legislation in place that decriminalized the act of medically assisting a person to die. And this was specifically for physicians and nurse practitioners. So the legislation also set safeguards around MAID. And there's a pretty extensive list on this. You had to be 18 years of age and eligible for publicly funded healthcare services. You had to be mentally competent. You had to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which is always a huge mouthful, I find. Natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, and this phrase was not used in the Supreme Court decision, and it's caused a lot of debate and around interpretation for assessors and providers as to what constituted a reasonably foreseeable death. Those seeking MAID had to make voluntary written requests and have these requests witnessed by 2 independent witnesses. And I should note here that there were restrictions around who could actually witness the request. So this presented a bit of a barrier to some people. The legislation stated that there had to be a 10-day reflection period between the request and the MAID provision. And the person seeking MAID also had to undergo 2 independent assessments for eligibility and approval. And that those had to be conducted by independent physicians and or nurse practitioners. And the last, I'm going to say, hurdle that had to be jumped was that the person had to be able to give informed consent at the time of the provision. So you can see there was a lot of I'm not going to say barriers in place, but a lot of safeguards in place for someone who is pursuing MAID. Now, in 2019, there was a charter challenge to the natural death having to be reasonably foreseeable. And that was held in Quebec, and it was brought to bear by 2 people, Jean Fouchon and Nicole Gladue. He had cerebral palsy, and she suffered from post-polio syndrome. The court sided with the plaintiffs, and the Canadian government chose not to appeal that decision. So what that meant was they now put Bill C-7, which is an amendment to Bill C-14, in place. Bill C-7 now gives us 2 distinct tracks for MAID. There's one where death is reasonably foreseeable, and one where it's not. Both of these tracks still have multiple safeguards that require you to be competent. You still have to be competent. You still have to be over 18 years of age, be eligible for publicly funded health care, and make a voluntary written request. That written request now, though, only has to be witnessed by one independent person. And the criteria as to who can witness has also been eased some. What the major changes are between 2016 and today is that for people who have reasonably foreseeable deaths, as part of their written request, they only have to be advised of the care options available to them. For those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, not only do they have to be advised of care options, they have to be offered consultation on their condition, and all alternate means to relieve their suffering must be considered by the applicant. So there's much more for the person who has a reasonably foreseeable death to undergo in their application. There is also a change to the assessors for people with reasonably foreseeable deaths. Their assessors need not have expertise in their condition. For those with non-reasonably foreseeable deaths, they have to have at least one of the assessors having expertise in their condition, or that person, the assessors must consult with someone who has expertise. There was a wait period. The wait period of 10 days has been removed for those with a reasonable foreseeable death. But for those with a not reasonably foreseeable death, they have to wait 90 days from their first assessment. So this is a reflection period for them. And lastly, the big difference is that reasonably foreseeable deaths, they can waive their final consent. If you recall, initially, you had to be able to give informed consent at the time of provision. Now, if your death is reasonably foreseeable, you can waive that final consent. Unfortunately, those with reasonably foreseeable deaths may not waive the final consent. And the last thing in what has changed probably is that Bill C-7 has opened the door to mental illness as a sole underlying cause to request MAID. And come into effect, however, till March or April of 2023. So a bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but those are the changes in a nutshell.
I should have picked an easy question first. Thank you for the fulsome answer, Marianne, and I will mention too that Cheryl denoted that there's a necessary journey page on the Mount Forest United Church website. If you go to the resources, Marianne's provided a link to a lot of some of what she. If you want to do a deeper dive into that or access some of the resources or supports that Dying with Dignity has, it's already up there on the resource page. So please do that. Are there any other comments from our panel on kind of the history of and where it's kind of landed today? Okay, Chris.
Well, I thought that was a really excellent summary, and I'm glad she did that. So I thought I was going to get called on to do that, and it is complicated and it is intricate, and I could even, I know this subject, and even as I'm listening to this really excellent description, I'm getting into you're getting into the weeds here about reasonably foreseeable death and what does waiver of consent mean, and it's really a subject that just lends itself to a lot of questions for the individual case, and the truth is that the vast majority of cases that I have done have been in the so-called track one, which is the traditional scenario where you have someone who is very ill, typically from a cancer or like overwhelming infection or something like that, and their death is soon. That's what reasonably foreseeable means. It doesn't mean a certain number of weeks or months. It just means that you can see how they would die naturally in the near future. So, yeah.
One of the questions is, where do you start? Like, what's the starting point if somebody is entertaining this?
Yeah, and my own personal policy as a physician, and I do a lot of palliative care, is that I don't bring it up to patients myself, like, oh my God, you're so ill, would you like, what about MAID? Like, I still think that that's not really quite appropriate yet. But people will intimate about it pretty readily. So people will say things like, I really wish I would just go to sleep and not wake up. Or, hey, can't you give me the big needle? Or, do I really have to go to hospice or something like that? And I personally, if anybody even mildly suggests it or brings it up in their own way, I think that is an invitation to a conversation. And I think that Canadians, in one form or another, so I think that Canadians are even vaguely often aware of what their rights are. And maybe that's just some brief report they saw on CTV, about a new law, or I think in some respects it's people know about this. Maybe they don't know the specifics or the process or that sort of thing, but they know. They bring it up in conversation. So what really is process? So what I tell patients are there are 3 forms. Fortunately for you, there's only one. Your form is Form A, and I do carry it with me, on the road. And I say, you know what, this is your request, and it's only 2.5 pages long, and most of it is for like name, birth date, health card number. And I give it to people or have people download it, off the web. And I say, you should read it and read it again and read it again until you're quite bored by the form. And you do need one independent witness. And that should probably be a friend or a neighbor. It probably should not be family, although there are exceptions to that. But it's just easier to tell people that it's not. And that it's your request for MAID, and you have to, have your marbles, mental capacity, and it's that the witness who's literally watching you sign. So you sign, and is attesting that you have capacity and that you're not being coerced. And once that form is signed, there is no waiting period, and that gets complicated. So the other 2 forms, B and C, are for the 2 assessors and another doctor, and that's the forms that need to be done. And then it's really about, where do you want this? Like, for example, in your home or in hospital. And I say that the mandatory, you cannot have MAID without completing Form A, but it doesn't commit you to anything. So you can sign Form A and never have MAID. And I have a fair number of people in that situation. I have a woman over in Rockwood who signed, it's called Clinician Aid A, who signed it, I think, at the beginning of COVID. And she still hasn't had it. And maybe I should get her to sign it again. Have no expiration on them. So those are the forms, and then it's really a question of getting the medications in. And then in Canada, the vast majority of procedures are done intravenously, so medication given by. So a patient needs 2 IVs, and why 2? Just in case one fails, and that happens. And yeah, that's the basics of process.
Would Rachel or Andrea Andrea like to contribute anything to that in terms of what you understand about the process from your perspective?
I would just add that I remember talking to you about it, Chris, a couple of years ago now, when I found out it spread to my brain, and I thought that might change my capacity to be mentally competent. So I did it really early, and it was such a relief to me that there was no expiry date. Like I wasn't going to go through this again a couple of years down the road when it still happened to be alive. And so it was kind of like a relief to have it done. But what I did, well, maybe I didn't see it coming, but the emotional impact that filling out the paperwork and going through that process, it asks something of the patient and the family to sit and imagine what that's actually going to be like. Because like I said in my little intro, it's no longer hypothetical. It's a real thing that you're actually putting in place that is a relief. The process of going through it carries some emotional weight.
I mean, the only thing I would then add to that is if this is something a person is considering, I encourage people to fill out the form because I personally have had cases and didn't fill out their form. And these were typically people who were compromised to start with and didn't have the wherewithal to recruit. At the time was 2 witnesses. So it used to be 2 before about a year ago. And this person in particular could not bring 2 witnesses to her house. She never completed Form A. And it was not a good death that occurred in hospital where she didn't want to be. So the flip side happens.
Elsa, if
Yes.
I may
Yeah.
just build on what Dr. Wellington has to say there. With going to one witness in COVID, in Ontario, you can now contact Diamond Dignity Canada, and they can provide a witness who can witness for you virtually. And that serves the purpose in smaller communities where someone may not have someone available to witness for them. Or in cases sometimes people aren't comfortable asking friends or family to witness for them. And this allows them to get their clinician's Form A completed and witnessed in a fashion that they don't necessarily have to have someone in the community do that for them.
That's really interesting. I'm seeing lots of nods in the room, Marianne, so I think that's something that a lot of people weren't aware of, so thanks for sharing that. And maybe I'll get you just to continue on. Do you happen to know the stat of how many people that complete that Form A never kind of go forward with it?
I believe that the second federal report on MAID in Canada came out early in 2021, said about 21% of the people that were approved for MAID did not avail themselves of it. I don't really have a statistic around people who complete A and never go through the whole process. Of that 21%, the reasons behind it, some just withdrew the request. Some were found to be ineligible for MAID. Some died prior to their scheduled procedures. Or they just chose not to set a date for their MAID procedure. We often hear that being approved for MAID gives a real sense of control when making end-of-life decisions, and that people know they can choose or not choose to have the procedure.
So Rachel and Andrea, I'm just going to call on the both of you, if you don't mind, just in terms of from a client's perspective, from a community member's perspective, how should service providers discuss MAID with you? So as a family member, if someone in your family has chosen MAID, how would you like their supports to kind of come and explain things to you? And how would you like to see it discussed?
Well, for my situation, My grandfather was very clear once he got his diagnosis of what his wishes were. So the ball was rolling pretty quickly for us, and we were like pretty much a fast track to having Dr. Lund come in and talk to us. So for me, we had all the information quite quickly, and we're pretty much know what was going on. I feel what would be the best, like if this had to happen to another family member, the discussion should happen as soon as the person has that diagnosis, so that it's something that the family can talk about and discuss and get their feelings in and out about it.
I think the way it happened for me was, it felt quite ideal. I mean, I was being a part of the palliative team, so I kind of had it in my awareness as a possibility. And when I brought it up with the team, they were, more than willing to have that conversation and to do it earlier. And all my questions were answered, and I felt well taken care of around this difficult topic. It just, yeah. I think the palliative team did a really good job of that. Yeah.
Good. Dr. Lund, where are those conversations happening? Usually, like it only happens when the patient initiates it, correct?
That's my own policy. And I think that may be an evolution. It's just that there are people who are opposed to MAID for a whole variety of reasons, including just or ethical, religious. So again, I'm not yet at the point where I bring it up with every patient, and that may be unfortunate, because I know for a fact that there are patients who bring it up with me as if they're going to offend me, or I'm going to be taken aback by the request, which I understand, I think is unfortunate. Yeah, so I think each practitioner has their own approach. I just sort of rely on people's, either the patient or their family's impetus to bring it.
Patients might feel that you might be uncomfortable having the conversation.
Yeah, oh, it's absolutely true, yeah. I mean, a little sidelight to that is that there's a lot of palliative physicians who don't regard MAID as part. It used to be the majority. I think that was a survey taken 4 or 5 years ago. So I think that things are changing. I see it as a continuum, but that's not universal.
So moving forward, one of the questions from the registrants was, could you describe what the difference is between palliative care and MAID?
Sure. I mean, palliative care is supposed to be, comfort care, so no longer chemotherapy or radiation, although there is such a thing as palliative chemotherapy, but you don't want to hear about that. So palliative care is about helping people to be comfortable wherever it is that they want to be, so managing, pain and shortness of breath and insomnia, those kind of symptoms. MAID is the active ending of someone's life, intentional. I mean, like I was describing, get the medications delivered to the house, you get 2 intravenous lines. Once you start, literally, it's about 10 or 15 minutes, and it's over. So that's the difference.
That's most definitely a difference. And I don't want to go down the path of what palliative care is like in depth, but what does palliative care look like in a rural community?
Well, I hope that palliative care in Wellington North is pretty good. I don't know what palliative care in Wawa
Right.
looks like. And I know it's uneven. It's definitely uneven. And, you know, it's about, like, for example, up north, a lot of the palliative care, as a lot of the care is given by nurse practitioners who are sometimes excellent. And that's why the law applies to nurse practitioners. They can provide it in, well, everywhere. I know nurse practitioners who have provided it in Kitchener, you know, not just some rural part of Ontario, you know. What was the question
The
again?
question was, what does palliative care look like in a rural community? Yeah.
Yeah, so quite variable, but it's not just, you know, the clinicians. It's also the nurses and the entire team, like everybody who's going into the home to provide care to that person. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I could speak to that. Being on the receiving end of care from the palliative team for the last 5 years, I think I've been like one of the longest recipients of, like, because I just keep on living unexpectedly. And at one point, the palliative team's like, no offense, but like, you don't really need us every week like you did, you know? And so I was fine. I'm like, yeah, okay, we can move to monthly visits because my health has gone up and down over the last couple of years, and sometimes I really needed them. For me, being involved with the palliative team has made a huge difference in terms of my of having a container, you know, somebody with Dr. Lund and the nurse practitioner Jessica and the nurses that would come for the monthly visits. There's also a spiritual advisor on the palliative team that I found incredibly helpful. This group has a way of holding this living with dying time in a way that is extremely helpful for me. And it's like coming to our house rather than me having to go somewhere, or, you know, in the middle of the night, if I get some weird new symptom and I don't know what's going on, I can call them and the nurse will call me back, and it's somebody that knows me, as opposed to going to the ER, which would be my only other option. And especially during COVID, that was a difference. Yeah.
I think that speaks quite highly of the palliative care.
Absolutely, and that's been my experience. Yeah.
That's great. So before we move on, I'm just going to say, Marianne, I'm wondering if you can mute yourself until you're speaking. Another question that we had, and I'll start with you again, Dr. Lund, and maybe we'll bring in Marianne as well, is how does MAID apply to those with dementia or Alzheimer's or other conditions that affect the brain and decision making?
It's a tough one. Right, Marianne? Oh, she's muted.
It's always the question that gets asked.
Yeah.
So I'll start, and then you can take over. Again, hard because, again, you have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. That's the fundamental criteria, right? And there are sub-criteria to that, like you have to be an irreversible. You have to be suffering, and that can be physical or psychological. And there are some who debate whether people with severe dementia evidence suffering. Really. And you have to have, you must have capacity when you make the request. That is a sine qua non of MAID. And so you can have you can have mild dementia, but then it's a question of, are you in track 1 where your death is reasonably foreseeable, and while dementia is considered a lethal diagnosis, it's not clear to everyone involved that you're going to die soon, which is what reasonably foreseeable means. And then there's track 2, which is not reasonably foreseeable, but again, with track 2, procedure, you must have capacity. There is no what's called waiver of final consent. And Marianne was talking about the waiver of final consent, which means on the day of the procedure, you don't have to capacity. But the detail on that is that a waiver of final consent is good for 1 day, August 10th, with 1 doctor. And that's only in track where your death is reasonably foreseeable. And also, when it comes to dementia, some people want to put it in their will or their living will that if they come down with Alzheimer's, they will be eligible for MAID, and advance requests for MAID yet. So we could spend hours or days on this topic, and it's an excellent one.
Yeah. Marianne, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I think Dr. Lund nailed on the head with that. A patient with dementia may meet criteria like any other illness, with natural death being reasonably foreseeable. Some modes of dementia are very predictory. And I myself have witnessed for patients with dementia. But as he said, it could be 5 years or more from the time of diagnosis. And the key here is that the person must be capable of request and at the time of procedure or have signed that waiver of consent. There's a very good webinar done by Leanne of Saskatchewan, who's an assessor provider, a geriatric psychiatrist. And she's done, I think, well over 200 assessments and provisions for patients with dementia. And I can get that link for you if you're interested in it. But it is a very, very complex situation.
I think we'd really welcome that link. I see some people feverishly writing. So I think if you provide that link, we will make sure and put it on the resources page. So the next question that's on our list that you all provided was, what are some of the barriers to accessing MAID locally? And I'm going to use the word barriers kind of broadly. And so I don't know, Rachel, if your family experience to that, and what can we, if we identify any, what can we do to remove them?
Like I said before, everything kind of happened really fast for us. So I never found we had any barriers at all. The team offered us lots of care, and then MAID was introduced. So for that question, yeah, I didn't experience any barriers at all. Everything was there for us, and the assistants and anybody that we wanted to talk to, all the phone numbers were available. So it was great help, actually.
Do you have any self-identified barriers?
I can think of barriers. I think hesitancy is one, right? Like I was alluding to, like some people just don't want to ask for it or don't know who to ask. I think this is a pretty good community for that. So around here, there are a couple of MAID providers, which is like a really good thing because occasionally we do go on vacation and stuff. But you also have to have providers and assessors, and they tend to be the same people. Even though any family doctor, like your own, or nurse practitioner can be an assessor, and it a degree or a 12-month course. You just have to read the criteria and be willing to do it. I don't think there's a whole lot of clinicians around who are against MAID, but you will find that for religious reasons. Remember that MAID does violate Catholicism. So very few of the patients that I have performed MAID for are Catholic. It's, you generally don't cross. But in Canada, certainly in Ontario, there's what's called a duty to refer. So if your physician or nurse practitioner is against a specific treatment or procedure, legally they refer you to another clinician who will do that. And that applies to MAID, it applies to birth control, and the list goes on and on.
Right.
I guess other barriers might be the intravenous issue, because some people are very hard to start IVs on, particularly people who are older or who've had chemotherapy, which can ruin your veins. So that can be a barrier. Usually we can surmount it. But
That's great. It's good to know. It sounds like we've got a pretty flexible service, or it's carried out here fairly well, and you're saying, but maybe a few more practitioners or assessors would be helpful.
yeah, I think so. And if anybody in the audience likes to start IVs, okay, and is really good at it, I'll give you my email. Okay.
Andrea and I were talking earlier, and we were going to hold this to the end, but we thought maybe before break time might be better. So do you want to introduce that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Poetry has become really important to me during this time, and I think I've really, it speaks to me in a way that I can't always describe what's happening to me. So I found myself surprisingly starting to write some poems, and this was a short poem that I wrote a little while ago about being with. And that's really what this whole thing is about. It's actually what you're all doing right now, is being with us as we talk about this. It's about showing up like this. Life asks us to be with whatever is happening. 2 syllables, 2 little words. Be with. Over the past 2 years, this has become a full sentence, a life sentence, or more accurately, a living sentence. Let's see if I can remember the next line. Sentence, alive, shifting moment to moment. Life asks us again and again and again to be with.
First thing I just wanted to mention, you'll notice that we're down a panelist. Some steam. So she's gone home, and I think we all collectively here understand and appreciate that it's important for her to listen to her body. So, but we really are appreciative that she was being able to be with us for as long as she was tonight. So moving on to our next question. So this is a question that came again from one of the registrants, which says, if I say I don't want any medical intervention in the future, will those wishes stand? And I think we touched on it a little bit, but, and is that different from MAID? So the term was medical intervention. If I say I don't want any medical intervention in the future, will those wishes stand?
Well, they should. I mean, if we're talking about wills, and living wills are supposed to be followed. I think that most of the time they are. Doesn't mean that that's true all of the time. You understand that the role of your power of attorney is to speak for what they understand to be your interests. In other words, speak for you, not speak for what they want, but for what you want. And the truth is that if the power is actually violating that code, they can be replaced, and because they're not doing their job correctly. And I do explain that to families, or I used to do it more when I practiced in town and in the hospital, and sometimes people designated who their power of attorney was, or necessarily even express their wishes. And so you'd be talking to families, you know, like in the middle of the night or in the emergency room, and there would be a crisis, and somebody would have decisions, and it was always helpful for families to learn that it really didn't matter what they wanted. Their job was to figure out what you would have wanted, you as the patient, if you could get up off the gurney or the bed, stand against the wall and look upon yourself and say, well, no, I don't want my heart to be shocked or to stuck down my throat. And that did simplify things a bit. So I part explanation for that, but you know lots about.
Yeah, and I think the next part of that is it different from MAID? And it says, if we have a power of attorney for health, can they override my wishes? I think that
they're supposed to, really. But for example, your power of attorney cannot enact MAID. Like, powers of attorney are totally separated from this process. They cannot request MAID for you. They cannot consent for MAID. It's separate.
Marianne or Rachel, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. I think what Dr. Lund has emphasized is the importance of having these conversations ahead of time when you're helping. What are your wishes? You'll often hear reference to advanced care planning. And also the importance of having these conversations with the person that as your power of attorney for health care, or sometimes they're called substitute decision makers. So if you take the time to have these conversations, the chances of your perspective in crisis are far better. And again, on the Dying with Dignity website, there is an advanced planning guidebook that you can work through and reflect on what your values and beliefs are and what you might want in crisis situations.
Thanks for that, Marianne. And we did host as part of our Necessary Journey series, we did host an advanced care planning event with that as well. And I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here. I think we're all, by being here, more open to having these conversations than most maybe. But I think we still have a ways to go in our culture to having these conversations when we're well. So you touched on this a little bit earlier, Marianne, when you first spoke, and the question is about mental health. And so, can someone with a mental health diagnosis make an application for MAID?
If your sole underlying medical condition is mental illness, you're not eligible to receive MAID. And this exclusion is going to remain in effect until March 17th of 2023, at which point it's going to be automatically repealed. Currently, there's an expert panel that's been formed. We're waiting for their report, which is supposed to be delivered this or next month. From that expert report, the government will set out the legislation, the safeguards around MAID with mental illness as a sole underlying condition. So that's the short answer.
Okay, so paying attention to 2023 going forward, things are going to be changing.
Right, because the eligibility criteria laid out in the original didn't explicitly limit access to individuals whose primary medical condition was mental illness. So sometimes don't realize that suffering caused by severe mental illness is no less real than suffering caused by physical illness. And in many cases, symptoms are indistinguishable from those caused by psychiatric medical conditions.
Okay. Well, I'm hoping whoever was here that answered that. Do you have something to add to that?
Well, I think that, again, it's also going to be really complicated when it comes to mental illnesses. The first thing I'd say is the federal government has an excellent reputation for not delivering things on time, and that has happened with the MAID legislation a number of times. So the latest iteration of MAID law about last March was actually extended 2 or maybe even 3 times past the deadline. So the deadline was whatever, and the government was given 6 months again and 9 months again, or whatever the months were. RoseAnne, you would know more about this than I. I'm kind of skeptical that the law will be changed next March, but who knows? But remember that, so this will fall into the not reasonably foreseeable death track. And so again, you have to meet every criteria that have been set out for track 1 or track 2. So you have to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which means an irreversible state of decline. The suffering will be obvious. But your mental illness will have to be deemed incurable. And not only that, a assessment period will stand, and you will have to have 2 assessors, like everybody has to have 2 assessors, one of whom can be a general doctor or nurse practitioner, but one of whom profess expertise in mental illness. And that does not have to be a psychiatrist. It can be a nurse practitioner. So there's no, so the specialist part of non-reasonably foreseeable death, it has to be a person with expertise in the field. You don't have to have particularly special initials after your name. But so the mental illness will have to be said by somebody with expertise that it is. So I don't know where this is all going, and I think it will be an uncomfortable place for some of us providers.
And I think I will just draw a line under that right now, because we don't know where it's going to go, but we'll definitely be paying attention to that as we move forward. Moving to the next question that we have, and this one's for you, Rachel. In your opinion, does the MAID process take something away from the person that chooses it?
So I definitely don't think it does. I feel like able to choose this gives you the choice of what you want. If you want to stay at home, if you want to die in dignity, you have all the check marks, and it's all up to you. In our situation, my grandfather was quite clear, and I feel that's because we watched 2 people suffer and die of natural causes in front of us. So he knew he didn't want to put that burden on family. He didn't want to go through what they went through. So he was pretty adamant that this was his choice. And because of that, I respected him for having that mind frame, and he got to go being comfortable too. And I know he was in a lot of pain and everything, but it was just so much more better, I feel, for myself, watching him make that decision, and we did it together, and there was a lot of care and compassion there. So I think it was a good process, and I don't think it was anything was negative with it. And I think it's really respectful that if people get to choose something like this, that there's something that they get to choose, and that's a lot.
So do you feel that, that we had some questions specifically from social workers that came in, that registered. So Dr. Lund, do you feel that social workers can support the medical team through this process, or is there a way that they can best support the medical team? I know there's social work on the palliative team already, but maybe there's also a social worker that has been supporting that patient in another capacity as well. Like, is there something else that social workers could be doing for your team?
I have a lot of respect for social workers. I think they do an excellent job. I love working with them. I mean, in regard to MAID, you know, I'm typically in a house for, 45 minutes, maybe to an hour, and incorporating palliative care and MAID discussions is really hard to kind of cover all that. I mean, I try, but I think that a well-informed social worker often knows a lot of the details of process, and certainly can spend maybe a little more time talking about, a patient's, emotions or any misgivings, with this. Families, what I say is that families react with a spectrum of emotion when it comes to MAID. It's all along a spectrum. I've had families essentially disown their loved one, the sick one, and nobody came to the MAID procedure. So it was just me and the nurse. Yeah. And on the other end of the spectrum, I did one with 30 people in the room. I was at a funeral home. That was interesting. And I did one in Louise Marshall, where half an hour later, all 4 sons who had been present put it on Facebook. So that's the spectrum of response. So social workers dealing with families is also so critical.
And so kind of the next part of that question, and maybe Rachel, you as well, like in terms of social workers, whether that be with the palliative team or other social workers, maybe through your family health team or whatnot, how do you see them being able to support the family when there is kind of, like when everyone's on board, that's wonderful, but what if there is a divide? Did you guys was there anyone in your situation, if you wanted to share, that was maybe not on board, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, we definitely had family members that were not on board, but I didn't have any social workers for them to talk to, and maybe that would have been a good thing, because then they maybe would have educated them a little bit on what was happening and help them through the process. So I think that's something that could be a good service, is have those social workers that are willing to talk to the family members that are for and against it, or even in between. So that option to have everybody have somebody to talk to would be really good.
This was a question that was also placed in our list, which was, in your opinion, is this suicide? Why or why not?
I can start that one. I guess it sort of is, because it wouldn't happen without the request, right? People are asking for this. It's interesting that, again, like I said, 99% of the cases in Canada are done intravenously. There is an oral option, but it's not used very much because, for one thing, the medications weren't really available for a while, and there are probably other reasons, whereas all states where it's allowed, the 10 states, it's all oral. There is no intravenous. That's my understanding. I was researching this last night. So it's all suicide, essentially, like really in the US. Whereas here, it's more like legal manslaughter. And so the law allowing MAID in Canada is an exception to the criminal code, right? Because normally, if one person causes the death of another, that is against the law. In Switzerland, which is the country most infamous for medical assistance, most of it, I believe, is the oral method where you get prescribed medication and you swallow it yourself. Sometimes a doctor is present in case something goes wrong, like it doesn't work or you start throwing up or things like that. But most of it, I believe, is that way. Yeah, I'm not sure I fully answered the question.
No, I think you fully answered the question. I think that's, what are ways to enhance education and awareness and reduce the stigma of even just talking about MAID? Kind of looking for general comments there, Marianne. Feel free to chime in.
Actually, I was going to jump in on the topic of is-MAID suicide.
Absolutely.
One of my volunteers from the chapter recently posted a blog on this very subject. She entitled it, "Why MAID is Not Suicide." And it tells the tale of two very different death experiences. In one, the person voluntarily asks for help dying, is approved, and she died with medical assistance. This allowed her the opportunity to have meaningful conversations about choices in her life, in her death. She was able to have closure with those family and friends closest to her. And also the comfort of knowing her family would find solace in her decision to end her suffering in a manner of her own choosing, basically her own way to die. Her death is described as, MAID deaths are consistently described as peaceful, with loved ones around, supporting her. The other death described was by suicide. And, if you go by the dictionary definition, the voluntary taking of one's own life. And the person was alone. The death was sudden, it was unexpected, undiscussed, unexplained to those closest. And it left the family bereft with so many unanswered questions. There was no closure and no peace. So this was of her own experience, and seeing that juxtaposition between those two deaths, I absolutely do not view MAID as suicide.
Thank you for sharing that, Marianne. I think I'd really appreciate a link to that blog post as well, because I think that I, for one, would like to read it. So we can add that to our resource list as well. So moving on to the ways to enhance education and awareness and reduce stigma around MAID, I'm open to all three of you to kind of commenting on how, I feel like part of what we're doing here tonight is trying to reduce that. I feel like people will likely go away tonight and have a conversation with other people about what they experienced here. But curious to hear from either or all of you.
I think the only thing I'll just add to this conversation is that MAID does not affect your life insurance. So we're talking about stigma here, right?
Yeah.
Like it's something people worry about. It does not. And MAID does not appear on the death certificate anywhere. What is listed as the cause of death is lung cancer or whatever it is that you were dying from, that you were dying from soon. The way that the province and the nation keeps statistics is that after each case, the provider has to call into the coroner's office in Toronto and basically sell the case that they've just done and list all of the details and, you know, who signed the witnessing and all that. It's a 20 or 30-minute conversation, and they keep the statistics private. You will see on obituaries some language about MAID. Some people just say it in the obit. Some people say, you know, on a date of their own choosing. Some people don't list it or write about it at all. I think there is still stigma, but I think it's falling away a little.
Anything to add to that, Rachel?
I think like the more people talk about it, having events like this, the little bit more easier it is to understand and grasp even. So yeah, the more it's out there, it just seems to be maybe a little less of a stigma.
Yeah. And then Mariana, I guess on your part, that's what Dying with Dignity is all about, is the education piece.
That is what we're all looking at, a large component. It's getting those conversations started and breaking down the barriers and the stigma around choosing MAID. And it's not only MAID, it's educating yourself about what options are out there open to you in your end of life decisions. Because if you have knowledge and you know what your choices are, you can have some control in your end of life decisions. You will have control in your end of life decisions. You know, talk to your doctors, talk to your family, talk to your friends. Just, you know, start the conversation. There's a lot of there on all different levels on palliative care, on MAID, and just learn as much as you can so you can make the decision about what's right for.
So our last question had to do with caring for others, not the individual patient. So the questions are, and I'll read all of them, but is participating in MAID difficult for those that have, so the physician or the nurse practitioner or the nurse or other palliative members, or for the family members that are present for that, or for the individuals themselves, from what I understand?
I don't think about it all that much, personally. I think it's an important thing to do. I don't think I've done a single provision person who regretted it. Like you have to ask for consent again, literally like 5 minutes before you do it. And I don't think I've met a single person who was equivocating. They wanted it. In fact, you know, as you know, there used to be a 10-day waiting period. That was an eternity for some people, right? It would be like, are you kidding? But there was a way to shorten it, but there were rules around that, and it was most of the time you couldn't abbreviate the 10 days. The person just had to wait. So I definitely think that for some family members it's difficult, and like what I said before is that you'll see a spectrum of response from families. I'd say the average family member's response is, I wish that my loved one were not choosing this, but I support them. I understand their decision, and maybe, just maybe, I want this option for myself down the road, so I shouldn't be a hypocrite, right? So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Anything you want to share about that, Rachel?
So for our situation, we had most of the family in the room. And I feel like, I guess it's however you bring it to the table too. We brought a comforting room. There was laughter and joking, and we had tried to make it as light as possible. We wanted like our grandfather to know how much he was loved and cared in that time. And so, yeah, it was light and airy. I think, like for myself, it wasn't a sad moment. It was just a joy moment, knowing that we were honoring his wishes, knowing that everybody was there celebrating his life with him. And it was just, the room was full of love and care. And again, we had humor. So even to the last moment, there was humor. So that it just kind of made it feel good. And so it wasn't difficult in our situation. And again, I think this is just how you bring it to the table.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Anything to add to that, Marianne?
I think Rachel has said it all.
Yeah, yeah.
It's amazing how people react in the love and the giving, and the thanks and gratitude people express when you do something as simple as witnessing the request for them. It's just a peace and gratitude.
And just so everyone's aware, we've actually gone through all the questions you've submitted. So, and I feel like we are right on time, which never happens. But I wanted to give each panelist just a second to, if there was anything else that they wanted to share before we close the evening. Marianne, is there anything else you wanted to share?
I think the important thing is to educate yourself, explore, reflect on what's important to you and what you might like your end of life to be like, and to talk to the people who are important to you and make them aware of how you feel, what your wishes are.
Lots of nods in the room. Rachel, is there anything you'd like to add to the end?
I feel from going through this, it really opened the door to communication with my family and loved ones. And there's a lot of even respect towards the health team being able to have an option like this. Again, it opened the door for communication, which is wonderful. Everybody from this experience has expressed their thoughts and feelings with it, and it's just great having education about something like this, and the more you know, the better it is to move on.
Good.
I don't think I have any sort of summary comments. I think we've talked about a lot of things. I'm much better at answering questions.
Fair enough.
Coming up with philosophical statements, but I'm open to questions if anybody wants now or afterwards.
Okay. Does anybody have a burning question? We do have just a couple of minutes. Does anybody have a burning question that they would like? Yeah.
The difference between those two, is that on?
Yeah, I'm gonna just check in with Marianne. So that resource you shared with me, Marianne, does it go into a little bit more detail on the specifics of the track 1 and the track 2?
There's quite a bit on the website, and I should mention we're going to be launching a new website shortly. I believe the question was about a little bit more detailed around track 1 and track 2.
Yes.
All right. Let me take a look and get you a link to something that addresses that exactly, because you could spend a lot of time on the website looking for it and perhaps not getting the answers that you need. So I will add that to my list of resources to send.
Thank you so much for doing
And
that.
if somebody really wants to, there is a support team at Dying with Dignity. So if you have a specific question, you can call them or email them, and somebody will respond to it.
That's great. Any other questions from the floor before we? So at this point, I think I would just like to thank our panelists for coming, and I wondered if we could just give them a round of applause.